Hi friends, in today's lesson we're going to look at the third way of solving a quadratic, and that is using the quadratic formula. So in order to do that, we need a formula. Don't worry about memorizing this. You'll probably get in a formula sheet somewhere. So the first thing I'm going to do is write this down. My formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c divided by 2 times a. Now, as you have guessed, the first thing that you're going to need to do is make sure that you use the right formula and make sure that you're plugging in the right numbers into the formula. So there's two ways of watching this video. The first way is by looking at how I'm solving the problem through this first exercise, and then I'm going to encourage you to pause it for the future exercises and just seeing if you can do one step at a time. And the first step being knowing what your quadratic formula is, or at least writing it down correctly. Making sure, you want to make sure that your equation, it has been simplified. And what I mean by that is, I want to make sure that everything is equal to 0. So if you have any numbers that are not 0 on the other side of that equal sign, you want to make sure you move all the things, all the numbers, all the variables, everything with their coefficients to the left-hand side, so that the only number on the right-hand side after the equal sign is a 0. The second step is to make sure that you identify A, B, and C correctly, because you have to be able to plug those in the formula. And if you plug them in wrong or you plug in the wrong value, you're going to get your answer wrong, and it's just going to be a really frustrating experience for you. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I'm going to do, since all of this is equal to 0 already, I'm going to identify A, B, and C. Now when I do this, you notice that I include the operation symbol that's right next to that coefficient. So for B, I'm going to include that negative sign. So B is going to actually be equal to -2. And A and C are actually positive 1s. That is super, super, super important for you to know, to include those operations as the symbols. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and plug these values into my formula. So you will notice my values I'm going to write in blue, so that you can see, because this can get really confusing. We have a lot of symbols, minus, plus or minus, and I want to make sure that we get it right. My B is going to be -2. My formula has a negative B to start out with. So what you'll notice is that I will end up with a double negative, because if my B is a negative and I already have another negative, you're going to have a double negative. So it's important that you don't skip any symbols and operations from your formula and just plug them in. So as you can see, I've plugged them in. My value's in blue. You can tell that I have kept the negative symbols from the formula as is. And now I'm just going to go in and simplify. So that simplifies as a +2. I'm going to keep the plus and minus for now, so that I'm not ready to get rid of this square root symbol yet. -2 squared is going to be a +4. Minus 4 times 1 is 4, and 4 times 1 is 4. So it's going to be actually 4 minus 4, which is going to be equal to a 0. So I'm going to go ahead and simplify all that, because that actually ended up being rather easy. And the 2 times the 1 is going to be a 2. Now, this means that you have two possible answers. X could either be a 2 plus square root of 2 over 2, and now the entire thing is over 2. That's another important thing to remember. Or x is equal to 2 minus square root of 2 divided by 2. Now, the square root of 0 is actually 0, so that cancels out. And then what you have is x equals 2 divided by 2, or x equals 2 divided by 2. Since you're not adding or subtracting anything to the square root, because that ended up being 0, you actually find out that both of these are going to be x equals 1, which means this particular quadratic has only one solution. And sometimes a quadratic can have many solutions, one solution, two solutions, or no solutions at all. And it is said that the quadratic formula is the most effective way of solving a quadratic equation. Maybe not the most efficient way, because it might take you longer. As you see in number 1, you could have easily just factored this out. But that's not always the case. The quadratic will always give you the right answer. Now, let's look at these 3 examples that I have. Now, This is the part where I encourage you to do step 1. Try to simplify. Do step 2. Try to identify the correct coefficients for A, B, and C for all of these equations. You can pause the video before I do it so that you can at least see if you're doing this part right. All right, so I'm going to start with number 3. I'm going to identify A, B, and C, including that operator um, next to the coefficient. So in this case, A is 2, B is 7, and C is going to be a negative 4. After I do that, I want to make sure everything is equal to 0. It already is. And now I'm just going to plug in those values into my quadratic formula like this. Once I plug this in, I can start simplifying. So x is going to be equal to a negative 7 plus or minus 7 squared is 49 minus 4 times 2 is going to give me negative 8. Negative 8 times negative 4 is going to give me a positive 32. I'm just keep that for now so that I don't over confuse things. And then 2 times 2 is 4. All right. Now I'm going to try to simplify what's inside the square root. 49 plus 32. I do a quick math. You obviously have your calculator. I don't in front of me right now. That's going to give me an 81. I notice that 81 is a perfect square, friends. Know your perfect square. It's going to save you a lot of time. So I can actually take this out of the square root symbol and end up with negative 7 plus or minus 9 divided by 4. So you have two options. You have negative 7 plus 9 divided by 4, or negative 7 minus 9 divided by 4. So if we simplify this even further, we're going to have x is equal to a positive 2 divided by 4, which is actually 1/2. Or we have x is equal to negative 7 and negative 9 will give me negative 16 divided by 4, which is actually going to be a negative 4. Now, as with everything, this has an easy way for you to check your answer because nothing is inside a square root. It's relatively easy to just plug these values in. And actually, this isn't, x wasn't even my variable. I did this completely wrong. It's supposed to be t equals. And in this particular quadratic, there's 2 solutions for you to check. So just plug them in. Keep things as fractions. Even though it looks complicated right now, just get familiar with how to manipulate fractions. It actually is easier. So when we raise 1/2 to the second power, you're going to end up with 1/4, and then you can just easily divide 2 by 4. But I'm going to right now just check my answer for these 2 solutions and make sure that they work out. All right, so I'm going to move on to number 4, number 5. So if you have identified the correct values here, please make sure you're checking them. For number 4, A is 1, B is negative 2, and C is negative 1. For number 5, you had to move that 3 to the other side, which is going to give you a negative 7. And that is how you end up with A equals 1, B equals 0, and C equals negative 7. So if you've been able to do this so far, you are on the right track. Now go ahead and plug in the numbers. You can pause the video now and just plug them in and make sure that you're doing the right operations. It can get really confusing, but it's just a matter of plugging them in and not leaving any symbol behind. Sometimes you'll have numbers inside the square root symbol that are not perfect squares but can be factors of or product of a perfect square. Like this case, square root of 8 is not a perfect square, but 4 times 2 make 8, and 4 is a perfect square. So you can actually pull out part of these factors that make up the product of 8 outside, as I have done here. So my square root of 8 is actually going to be 2 square root of 2. And the other important thing to remember about this problem is when you are dividing, you are dividing the entire numerator. So 2 plus square root of 8 or 2 plus 2 square root of 2 is being divided by 2. So each of those is being divided by 2 individually. You could do this two ways. The first way is you could factor out the 2 and you see what I end up with here. And that way you can easily cancel out. 2 divided by 2 is 2. You end up with nothing but a 1 in your denominator. So that means your answer is either 1 plus square root of 2 or 1 minus square root of 2. It has two solutions. Or you can just divide each one individually. 2 divided by 2 plus 2 divided by 2 square root of 2. But I always tend to go with the factoring method. It tends to be a little bit easier for me. All right, let's go ahead and tackle this number 5. Again, just plug them in on your own. There will be some times where you have b that equals 0. Remember, b is the coefficient that is next to the variable that's raised to the power of 1. And in this case, we don't have 1. So this makes it a little bit confusing, but when this happens, we just mean that b is 0. And when you plug it in, it actually makes it a lot easier on the math because you're not adding or subtracting anything because it's 0. Again, we're going to have to find the factors of 28. Hopefully one of them is a perfect square, and it is. 7 times 4 make 28, so we can actually pull out the square root of 4, which is 2, and the square root of 28 actually becomes, in a simplified manner, 2 square root of 7. Now you don't have to take the greatest common factor of that because it's just 2 square root of 7 divided by 2, which would actually be square root of 7. So you have two options here. It can either be a positive square root of 7 or a negative square root of 7. So this one also has two solutions. Now for these two problems, checking to see if your answers are right is a little challenging, so just keep that in mind.